Over to you.
Thanks, Manal. Hi, everyone. A couple of disclaimers before I speak. I know some of you have attended talks by me in the past, but for those who haven't, a couple of warnings beforehand before I start. There'll be no slides from me. There's a main good reason for that. A lot of my talks are about personal experience. If I'm given a talk about personal experience, I would prefer not to use slides simply because, much to the nervousness of people who book me for the first time, I don't plan talks when it's about personal experience, because the one thing I am an expert on is me. And I would rather just speak naturally as if it's one-to-one with somebody who are asking me about how I experience life. So there'll be no slides. So unfortunately, you're going to have to look at me for the next 25 minutes. But I haven't made an effort because of that. So I can promise you've got no pajama bottoms on below your screen. And I do have a tendency as well, when I'm talking about personal experiences, to talk too much. So Manar has kindly given me a time slot which helps and makes it easier. But yeah, fortunately, people who booked me in the past have always booked me again. So it's not been too daunting for them when they've realised that it works the way I do it. I mean, it's different to everybody else, but it works for me. So I'm going to talk to you today about anxiety, mainly, how I experience anxiety. The thing about anxiety and being autistic is they tend to go hand in hand. I'm aware that there are some people who are autistic who don't experience particularly anxiety, but the vast majority of autistic people that I know personally experience anxiety and panic attacks to varying degrees, some very significantly having an impact on their day-to-day lives, myself included. My history with anxiety goes back way before I was diagnosed, goes back to childhood. My anxiety in childhood was not too bad, but it would depend on circumstances. So like a lot of autistic children, whether diagnosed or not, sudden changes would cause anxiety with me. One quick example that comes immediately to mind was I was a real bookworm and comic fanatic as a child, still am. And I used to get comics delivered on a certain day every week. And I can remember that there was a really bad winter one year, I think it was 76, when I would have been about 6 years old. And because of the severe snow, it changed the day that I would be getting my comics, and I had an extreme meltdown. It's the first meltdown that I can actually recall having as a child. And it was purely just because the day changed and my routine had gone. And it wouldn't affect most people, but it affected me really significantly. But on the whole, as a child, not too bad, not too overwhelming. And I was kind of left to my own devices, really, not in a bad way, but in the sense that I was a third child, and my parents were more relaxed, as you always are, the more children you have. So as long as I was happy, content, and thriving, then that was fine with them. And so I had no sudden changes in routine generally. What did happen was a significant impact in early adulthood, and that's when my anxiety went to a whole new level. And autistic people can take anxiety to a whole new level compared to non-autistic people, and that's not to diminish the experiences of non-autistic people with anxiety, because anybody can be affected by it. But particularly autistic people are more prone to anxiety, and in my experience from talking to people, the severity of it as well. So in early adulthood, there was one significant instance that I always think of that really started off going from being reasonably anxious most days to being severely anxious and having extreme panic attacks. And it was when I was I would have been about 23 at the time. And I was married, and we had our first child, who was still young, but life was good, life was fine. I was content, and no real problems, no stress. And this was before I'd learned how to drive, many years before I'd learned how to drive. And I was living in a small town where to go anywhere significant, you had to go to the next town, which involved a bus journey of 20 minutes or so. And I had to go somewhere reluctantly, because I didn't really like using public transport. But I had to, and on the way back, I was on the bus, and I was about halfway home. And in between the two towns was quite a rural area. All of a sudden, I became really breathless, extremely breathless. And I was a bit puzzled as to why. I didn't feel sick or ill. and it kept getting worse and worse very quickly. And very rapidly, I can only describe it as a numbness started. First in my hands, going up my arms, then in my legs, traveling all over me. And within a few minutes, the numbness got so severe that I was really panicking at this point. And it felt like I was being suffocated and my heart was racing. Again, I didn't feel sick or anything. I hadn't been ill. And it got so severe very quickly that my joints in my hands and my knees started locking. And I had no idea what was going on. I've never experienced anything like it before. Plenty of time since, but not until that point. And I was, I was terrified. That's no exaggeration to say I was terrified. And I pressed the button on the bus to stop the bus, not really knowing where I was. I had a rough idea, but I knew it was a rural area. And we were just approaching the bus stop, so I got off with a bit of difficulty, but I managed to get off the bus. And outside was one of these small brick bus shelters with a bench next to it. Unfortunately, there was nobody about because I was very self-conscious. And I didn't want to create a scene. I didn't want anybody staring at me. So once the bus drove off, I was sat on the bench, and it took a good 10, 15 minutes of deep breathing and trying to relax before this started to pass. It didn't go completely. I was still breathless, but I started getting the feeling back in my joints and in my legs and my arms. So once I got the feeling back and I felt well enough to get up, I started walking home. And I wasn't really sure how to get there because my sense of direction is horrific. So I just followed the road that the bus would go on. And the route it took me home took me past my GP surgery. And without thinking, I went straight in. And my GP at the time, this is, I've since moved many years ago, but my GP at the time knew me well enough that if he saw me come into his surgery, something was wrong. Because not just an autistic thing, like many men, I tend to avoid going to the doctors unless I feel like I'm at death's door. And I went in and immediately made an appointment with him, and I managed to get one for later that day. Back in the days when you could get an appointment quite quickly. And I saw the GP, explained what had happened, and straight away he said, it's anxiety, you've had a bad panic attack, don't worry, it's very common. Most people experience it at some point in their lives. 9 times out of 10 it'll pass, and that could be your only experience of it, or you could have a few episodes. But what actually happened was it got progressively worse until it became a daily occurrence. So I went back to the GP a couple of times, and he was concerned enough that he thought I would benefit from some counselling. So I was referred to a psychiatric nurse, and I had weekly counselling sessions for a year. Very nice man, but neither of us had a clue that I was autistic. And in hindsight, growing up and then becoming an adult, being autistic but not knowing you're autistic is bound to have a significant impact on your mental health as well. So I had that going on as well. I had other comorbidities that very often come along with being autistic, but at that time nobody knew these comorbidities were actually because I was autistic. So I was being tested and medicated, and a lot of doctors scratching their heads, not being able to figure out what was wrong with me. Of course, there was nothing wrong with me. I was just autistic, but nobody knew. So that didn't help with the anxiety. At the end of the year's counselling, it got to the point where my counsellor decided he really couldn't do any more for me. It had improved, but it was still affecting me on a daily basis. The panic attacks were less regular. The anxiety, the way I differentiate it was, I would say the panic attacks are when I'm so bad that I can't get up and my joints are locking and I'm hyperventilating that much that I'm becoming immobile. Whereas the anxiety, I would say, it's just being out of breath and a racing heart and very anxious. So I was still having anxiety on a daily basis, but the panic attacks had lessened and were more infrequent. So he said, look, there's not a lot more I can do. I've got to know you extremely well every week for a year. We've delved into everything in your life and I can't find anything that's a root cause, which in one sense didn't help. But on the positive side, he was great and taught me some coping mechanisms that I still use today. So it was those days that I first heard the expression fight or flight. And it was through those counselling sessions that I realised that I was normal. And this is a normal, reaction that people have. And it was nothing to concern about. And the most important thing of all was I discovered I wasn't dying. So that helped with the anxiety bit as well. So I was discharged from that, carried on through adulthood, and then to jump many years, because that's for another time, I was diagnosed in my 40s. I'd spent several years researching it, and completely by accident came across an article about autism and about Asperger's, and it ticked every box, and my ears pricked up, and I thought, no, hold on a minute, this can't be. And I was almost in denial and tried to discredit everything I read about it and thinking, this can't be right, this isn't me. Because like a lot of people who were born in the 70s and teenagers in the 80s, knowledge was extremely limited in those days compared to how it is now. So once I had convinced myself I was actually autistic, I then went to see the GP, who was fantastic, who referred me, and I was on the waiting list. And then I got another long story short, I was diagnosed at the retreat in York, and it changed my life. It was almost like a massive weight was lifted. Now, up until this point, the anxiety hadn't gone away. It was a daily occurrence, and quite often quite disabling. But what the diagnosis did was it gave me understanding about me. I discovered who I was, what my strengths were, what my weaknesses were, and more importantly, that the anxiety didn't always have to have a reason behind it. Just being autistic can be reason enough, because a slight change in your routine can cause anxiety, whereas for neurotypical people, that tends to generally not be a problem. So there's so many things that added up once I was diagnosed that it actually helped with the anxiety to a degree, because I had more knowledge about who I was, what made me tick, and why I experienced certain things the same way other autistics experience them, in the sense that anxiety was nothing unusual, unfortunately, but it gave me a lot of answers, so that helped significantly. But the anxiety didn't go away, and it probably never will go away, and that's the honest truth. So if anybody's listening hoping that the anxiety they're experiencing if they're autistic is going to go away, we're all different. I can only speak for me. In my experience, it's not gone away, but it's part of life. So I cope with it much better because it's part of my daily occurrence. So I don't find it as overwhelming as I did. How do I cope with it is the difficult one to answer, though, because, like I said, everybody's different. No two autistic people are the same. So I can't give you a definitive answer. What works for me is going to work for you or your children or people you work with. But I can explain how I experience it and then what coping mechanisms work for me. And it may well resonate with some people. And quite often I find that it does. But the way I cope is quite unusual, I suppose. It probably is. I don't really know. To me, it's normal. But it's normal for me. But I'm conscious of the fact that some of my coping mechanisms will probably not appear normal to non-autistic people, if that makes sense. So much so that I consciously mask it. And again, that's another topic. But when I mask it, masking itself can cause anxiety, and it's stressful. And having to put on a mask doesn't help. But some of the coping mechanisms that help me, I wouldn't do in public, because I'm conscious of the fact that to the outside world, it would look odd. Some of my coping mechanisms I do in public because they're not very visible. So I'll give you some brief examples of what works for me and what doesn't work for me. And again, I've heard many people, autistic and not, who suffer anxiety and panic attacks that are quite severe, that they have certain coping mechanisms that I've tried that just don't work for me. And that's the downside to having anxiety, whether autistic or not. It's not, there's no one size fits all when it comes to what works to help you. But the one that helps me the most, and I've never actually really explained this to anybody, I don't think, but the one thing that helps me the most is quite unusual, in the sense that if you saw me doing it, and especially if you didn't know I was autistic, you think, what's he doing? Which is why I do it at home. Being at home helps massively with anxiety, because this is my safe place. I can be myself, I don't have to mask. And that's not the same, I'm not anxious at home. I get anxious for no apparent reason whatsoever. A lot of people who have anxiety, and a lot of autistic people who have anxiety, you can spot triggers. So that's not to say I won't have triggers for anxiety, because I do. So changing routines, overwhelming my senses, because like a lot of autistic people, I have a lot of sensory difficulties. and that in turn creates anxiety, and if it's bad enough, will develop into a panic attack or a meltdown, or even a complete shutdown on the odd occasion. So what helps me when I'm at home is, like I said, that there's very often no trigger. So for example, I can be sat at home on an evening, children in bed, sat with the TV on, sat with my wife watching TV quite happily, quite content, no obvious stress that I can put my finger on that I'm under. And for no reason whatsoever, inexplicably, I will suddenly get a panic attack. And within a minute, it'll go from starting to extreme. And it's like it was that instance I described on the bus, where my breathing, it's almost like you get off a plane into a hot country from a cold country and the heat hits you and you can't breathe. It's almost like that and not going away, and you're struggling to get air in. You are breathing okay, but you don't feel like you're breathing okay. And that in turn makes the anxiety levels worse, and it develops into a full-blown panic attack. When I'm at home, it's much easier to cope with because I know what works for me. And I'm sure any autistic people listening are going to try this. If it works, fantastic. Please do let me know if it works, because I've never told people about this actual coping mechanism before. I've taught people plenty of coping mechanisms. This one's a bit personal. So what works for me when I'm at home is, if I'm sat on the sofa watching TV and I suddenly get a severe panic attack, I will immediately lie on the floor, flat on the floor. But I don't want to miss the TV program. So what I'll do, I'll get a cushion and I'll put my head on its side and I will lie as flat as possible. But the cushion isn't for comfort, it's so I can still see the TV. So I will lie flat on the floor like that, with my hands, palms down on the floor, my body face down, flat as anything, and my head to its side so I can watch the TV still. And within a couple of minutes, my breathing gets much better. I can't explain why. I'm sure there's plenty of psychologists and psychiatrists watching who might have a very rational explanation for that, but I just know it works. And that's what I do every time, and it works a treat. It's very rare that doesn't help significantly. I'm not saying the anxiety goes completely, but it goes enough for me to be able to get up, sit down, and relax again. And sometimes it can take minutes, sometimes I can be lying on the floor for an hour. But along with the anxiety, when it's like that and I have to lie down, is significant nausea and stomach pains, because one of the comorbidities I struggle with, and I don't actually struggle with being autistic, and this is one thing that people misunderstand about being autistic. I struggle with the comorbidities that come with it, and it's a lottery what you're going to get, if at all, and how many you're going to get. I don't struggle compared to a lot of people, but I do struggle with some things significantly, one being sensory and the other being the gastro problems that is extremely common amongst the autistic population. And that's the one thing, you'll hear the question, would you change anything? If you could take a magic pill. No, I wouldn't want to not be autistic, because then I wouldn't be me. That's, it comes together. It's not, I would have a completely different personality if I wasn't autistic. But if there's one thing I could change, if you could give me a pill and I wouldn't have any stomach problems for the rest of my life, where's the pill? Show me the pill, because that would solve so much. And the problem is, it's a catch-22, because the stomach problems, and I didn't know this for many years, but the stomach problems I've suffered since a very young age. I can remember 4-year-olds, doctors being absolutely baffled as to why I had stomach problems all the time, because they couldn't find anything wrong. But the stomach problems cause anxiety, because the stomach problems, I know the nausea is going to come, and the nausea is horrific, and it's never ending, and you just feel on the verge of being sick constantly, and it's the worst thing. And the anxiety makes it worse. So I'm anxious about that, and then the nausea is making me anxious, the anxiety is making me nauseous, and it's a vicious circle. But lying down on the floor when I'm at home is one coping mechanism for me. Another coping mechanism for me that does help a lot of people is, most autistic people will have very intense interests. Now, I know some autistic people dislike the term special interests. Me, I don't mind either way, whether the term's used or not, it doesn't matter to me. But intense interest is fair, because we do tend to have good focus on whatever it is. And it could be video games, it could be certain things that you collect, it could be anything at all. I have a couple, but one of my interests is, I've played the drums since a very young age. And like most adults who played the drums as a teenager, They gave it up when they got married and the children came along. And then what happened with me was a few years ago, I invested in an electronic drum kit, which I hadn't had a drum kit for years. And that's where I am now, actually. I'm tucked away upstairs because the children are out at school, and I don't want to be one of those videos you see on the internet with the children come into view while you're trying to talk to someone. But what I do is I bring myself up here, and I don't know if you can see them or not, but the drums are behind me. So I come up here and I put the headphones on and I play my drums when I'm feeling anxious. And it's the brain's a fascinating thing, because I can be extremely anxious, out of breath, come up here, connect the iPhone to the drum kit, put some of my favourite music on and just play along for half an hour, take the headphones off, and I'm absolutely fine. Anxiety's gone, breathing's completely normal. I won't say it doesn't come back, because there's many times I take the headphone off, say I feel great now, walk downstairs, boom, back again. But it gives me a good excuse to take myself away from everyone and come and play the drums again. But that works for me, and it doesn't mean you have to go out and get a drum kit. It means that whatever your interest is, if it's intense enough, that can be enough focus to help with the anxiety. It doesn't matter what that interest is. Invest in that interest, spend time doing your interest. And if you're a parent of an autistic child, a teenager, I know many parents with an autistic teenager will think, oh, he's in his room again, or she's in her room again, doing whatever it is that they're interested in. That can't be good for them. It can actually be very good for them, because that could be where their way of coping with life, anxiety, worries, and they may feel absolutely fine while they're doing that. And if that works, fantastic. Everybody will have their own thing that works, but it comes down to whatever their interests are. Most parents will know what that interest is. They'll have a good idea. So if you have young children, try helping with that if they're feeling anxious. Get them involved in whatever is their interest that they spend most time with and get most enjoyment from. The other thing I would mention as well before we finish is, I get asked a lot, obviously, at the moment about the lockdown and about the pandemic and how I've experienced it. So it would take me forever to explain it to you, but I'll explain briefly that when the lockdown started, I think it started it was on a Friday. It was certainly a Friday when the schools closed, because any parent will remember when the kids came home from school and didn't go back again. So it was definitely a Friday. And 2 days before that, I was in a supermarket, a large supermarket. And this was right at the time, and I'd been trying to limit, as Connor touched on earlier, about the news intake, and I'd gradually been getting more anxious and suffering bad panic attacks as this pandemic started to progress, to the point where it was really severe with the panic attacks. They were daily, at least once a day. Anxiety was multiple times a day. And it touches again on what Connor said about, well, I'll go back to the supermarket first. In the supermarket, it was this time when it was on the news about the panic buying. But I'd not been watching the news, which is why I mentioned what Conrad said about limiting your news intake, because I quickly discovered that if it did that, it helped with the anxiety a lot. Didn't go away, but it helped massively, because I was watching everything that I could get my hands on and reading everything. And the worst thing as well was social media, because there were so many things shared on social media that were inaccurate, but you would read them anyway. So no wonder, not just autistic people, but half the population with anxiety levels were through the roof. So I was in a supermarket, having watched all this going on the TV and reading stories on social media, and suddenly I was surrounded by panic buyers, and they were clearing the shelves, and I was stuck in the middle of it. And I knew that the first full-on meltdown that I'd had in many years was coming on rapidly. So I got home as quick as I could and locked the door and didn't come out again. And I stayed indoors for many weeks. And to very quickly tell you in the last couple of minutes, the difference it made to me was the first 2 weeks were very anxious. I was never depressed. I don't really get depressed. It's a very different thing for me. The anxiety and the panic attacks, there's no depression connected with it. But I was so anxious and the panic attacks were so severe. But once I was at home, a lot of my, like many people, a lot of my work and things that had been booked were all cancelled almost overnight. So I made the most of it, and I was at home, and like I said before, this is my safe place where I can be myself, I can relax, and I can use coping mechanisms that I won't do in public. And those first 2 weeks were a living hell. They were horrific for me. But after those first 2 weeks, things started improving rapidly, to the point where by 4 weeks after lockdown, I felt fantastic. And the one thing I did notice after 4 weeks was, for the first time in my life, I had no stomach problems. I was getting up in the morning, waiting for the nausea to start, and there was nothing. And I was waiting for the stomach cramps to start, and there was nothing. I was waiting for the dizziness from sensory overloads to start, and there was nothing. And it was really weird. It was the strangest thing, but in a good way. What I will say, though, not really want to end on a negative note, but once the lockdown started to be lifted, in the last couple of weeks, I've started venturing outside again, and the stomach problems are back straight away. So I hadn't really realised the significance of anxiety and stomach problems and sensory overloads all being connected as much as they are, because as soon as lockdown was lifted and I started venturing outside, I actually went to a supermarket again for the first time since before lockdown, and sensory overloads and stomach pain, nausea, dizziness, anxiety, panic attacks, all connected. So it shows you the significance of environment, which is another thing that is a big factor with anxiety. So I would say as well, be aware of environments. If you have autistic children, keep a mental note of when they seem to be more anxious, because environments have a massive impact on me and a lot of autistic adults. But yeah, the one thing I would leave, I would say in ending, is whatever works is fine. It may not seem normal, and I hate that word, but it's the only word that comes to mind. It may not seem normal to non-autistic people that this autistic adult or autistic child is using as a coping mechanism, but that doesn't matter. If it's working for them, that's fine. Whatever works is absolutely fine. If you're an autistic adult and you think I shouldn't really be doing this, or this isn't right, or it doesn't matter. If it helps and your anxiety is lowered by doing it, and you're not harming anybody else, then what's the problem? Whatever works, especially during these really strange times. So I'll leave it there. Manal's going to be absolutely astounded, because I do have a bit of a reputation as being the autistic Ken Dodd. I don't know when to stop. And without a time limit, I'll be talking for hours. And I know she's laughing at me saying this, because I've told her this many times. But yeah, it's quite an achievement to actually finish on time for me. So I'll hand you back to Manal. I don't have any slides to send anybody, but like Connor, if you want to send me a message, ask any questions after the Q&A, you'll find me on Twitter. Just do a search for my name on Twitter. There I'll be. Feel free to message me if you have any questions. Back to Manal.